Good evening. Tonight, we step into the timeless realm of ancient Greece, where the fates spin their threads and the balance between mortal and divine is kept with quiet precision. This isn't just a set of old warnings. It's a meditation on destiny and measure, on pride and acceptance, on the patterns woven through every life. We'll follow the dark thread that runs through the house of Atreus, a grandfather whose pride opened the door to horror, a father who paid in blood for his brother's crime, and a king who believed glory could justify any sacrifice, even his own daughter's life. You may think you know these tales, but there's a deeper wisdom in the way they intertwine, in grief and transformation, in vengeance and justice, and in the ancient understanding that some debts span generations. If you're enjoying these journeys into myth, a quick like or subscribe really helps. Most of all, I'd love your help making these stories better. Please tell me in the comments how you think I can improve them, anything that would make them more meaningful or soothing for you. Your feedback shapes what comes next. Now make yourself comfortable, lying down or sitting. Let your breath slow and simply be present. Tonight's tale is patient and unflinching, meant to carry you softly toward rest, even as it honors the weight of these ancient choices. Let's ease into this journey together, where the table is set with terrible hospitality, where the net is woven thread by thread, and where the stories are as old as starlight. In the beginning was the table, and at the table sat a man who thought himself the equal of those he served. Tantalus had been favored beyond the measure given to other mortals. The gods had welcomed him to their feasts on bright Olympus, had shared with him the nectar that does not fail, and the ambrosia that knows no corruption. He had heard Zeus speak of justice and Hera, of the order that binds even the divine will. He had watched Apollo tune the strings of creation, and Artemis draw her silver bow across the threshold of the wild. All this had been granted him, not as right, but as grace, and grace is a gift that asks for nothing yet cannot bear contempt. Tantalus grew proud in his favoring. He began to think that the distance between mortal and immortal was a matter of accident rather than nature, a trick of birth that wit might overcome. He stole the food of heaven and carried it down to his companions, as though the boundary between earth and sky were a line a clever man could erase. He whispered in the courts of men the counsels he had heard among the gods, as though trust were a garment to be worn and discarded at pleasure. Still the gods were patient. A warning might have turned him back. A single clear word might have drawn the line again, bright and unmistakable. But Tantalus went further. He invited the gods to his own table, set in his own hall, and prepared for them a feast. The preparations were elaborate, the invitations gracious, the setting fine. The immortals came, curious perhaps, or willing to grant one more measure of trust to a man who had already spent his store of it. They reclined on the couches Tantalus had spread for them. They lifted the cups he offered, and when the platters were brought forth, steaming and rich with savor, Hera looked at Zeus, and Zeus looked at Apollo, and Apollo's face became as still as winter. For Tantalus had taken his own son, young Pelops, beautiful and beloved, and had made of him the meat set before the gods. It was a test, he may have thought, or a joke, or the ultimate proof that mortality and divinity might sit at table as equals if only a man dared enough. Perhaps he believed the gods could not tell sacred from profane, life from death, love from its monstrous inversion. Perhaps he thought that in their eating they would become complicit, bound to him by shared transgression. The gods did not eat. They saw and they knew, and the silence that fell upon that hall was the silence that comes before the mountain breaks or the sea rises beyond its ancient bounds. Zeus rose from the couch, and his rising was the rising of storm. The tables overturned, the cups shattered. The walls of the hall seemed to lean inward, as though the very stones recoiled from what they had sheltered. Tantalus was taken to a place where hunger and thirst have no end, where the water recedes from the lips and the fruit withdraws from the hand, where desire lives but satisfaction dies, moment by moment, forever. The punishment was exact. He had made a mockery of the host's duty and the guest's trust. Now he would be host and guest to his own undying want. But the child, what of the child? The gods gathered the pieces and made him whole. Hera breathed life back into the limbs. Athena restored the sinews. Apollo set the heart beating again. And Demeter, grieving for all mothers, replaced the shoulder that had been lost with one of ivory, pale and gleaming and terrible in its beauty. Pelops lived again, more beautiful than before, marked by the god's own hands, and yet marked too by the crime that had unmade and remade him. He had been dead. He had been eaten. He had been restored. These were truths that could not be taken back, and they traveled with him like shadows that learn to walk upright. When Pelops came to manhood, he was golden with favor, strong and fair, and destined for a kingdom. In the distant land of Pisa, King Oenomaus ruled, and he had a daughter named Hippodamia, lovely as the morning. But Oenomaus loved her with a love that had curdled into possession, and he set a condition for her marriage. Any suitor must defeat him in a chariot race, and the defeated would die. 13 suitors had already perished, their heads mounted above the palace gate, testimony in bone to a father's refusal. Pelops came to race, and he desired victory. He was young, and the god's favor sat lightly on him, a gleam he had learned to wear but not to weigh. He went to Myrtilus, the king's charioteer, and offered him gold, or perhaps a promise, or perhaps a share in the prize itself. Myrtilus, whether for greed or pity, or his own desire for Hippodamia, loosened the bronze pins that held the axle of the king's chariot. When the race was run, the chariot broke apart, and Oenomaus was thrown and killed, dragged by the horses he had trusted. Pelops won the bride and the kingdom, but Myrtilus claimed his reward: gold, a share in rule, or the bride's affection. And Pelops, fearing the witness or the claim or simply the persistence of debts, cast him from a cliff into the sea. As he fell, Myrtilus cursed the house of Pelops. "Let treachery eat treachery," he cried, "and let no son rest easy in the father's chair." It was a small curse, perhaps, the spite of a dying servant, but it fell onto ground already prepared. Tantalus had opened the door. Pelops had left it ajar. Now the darkness could enter as it pleased, soft-footed and patient. Pelops fathered sons, and among them were Atreus and Thyestes, twins in ambition, or near enough in age that they seemed two halves of a single will. They grew tall in Mycenae, in the great palace with its lion gate and its halls that smelled of oil and bronze, and the smoke of sacrifices offered to gods whose attention was not always kind. Pelops had taught them statecraft, the management of flocks and men, the balancing of alliance and threat. He had not taught them, perhaps, how to bear each other. Atreus was the elder, and in him ran a strain of something cold and bright, the need to be first not merely in place but in honor, in the eyes of gods and men. Thyestes was quicker to laughter, easier in his body, more beloved by those who do not look too closely at what moves behind a charming smile. Each saw in the other a rival. Each believed the throne of Mycenae should be his, by right, or worth, or destiny. Their father died, and the city looked to the sons to resolve the succession. There were omens. A lamb was born in Atreus's flock, gold-fleeced, a wonder that seemed to declare the favor of heaven. Atreus took it as a sign that the kingship was his. He placed the fleece in a chest and locked it away, a treasure and a token, proof that the gods spoke his name. But Thyestes had already learned the secret paths, the unguarded hours. He had found welcome in the bed of Erope, Atreus's wife, whose reasons were her own. Desire or boredom, or a calculation that a king's brother might one day be a king. She gave Thyestes the key to the chest. He took the golden fleece and showed it to the people, claiming that heaven's favor had passed to him. Mycenae acclaimed Thyestes king. Atreus withdrew to nurse his wound, and the wound was deep, cut equally by betrayal of wife and brother, trust and blood, both broken. He was methodical in his grief. He did not rage, he thought. He prayed, too, in the dark of the palace shrine, where the gods sometimes listen and sometimes turn mortal pain to their own purposes. Zeus sent Hermes to Atreus with a question. If the sun itself were to reverse its course, running backward through the sky, would that not be a greater sign than any golden fleece? Atreus proposed a compact to his brother. Let the gods decide between us. If the sun runs backward in the heavens, then the throne is mine. If not, I will accept your rule without further contest. Thyestes, confident in the impossibility, agreed. The next day the sun rose in the west. The light came from the wrong direction, pale and sickly, as though the world itself had been turned around to face its own beginning. Men and women emerged from their houses and stood in silent terror. The flocks milled in confusion. Birds flew in aimless circles. For one long day, the sky proclaimed that the order of things could be bent to prove a single man's right. And when the sun set in the east, Thyestes knew that he was undone. Atreus took the throne. He banished Thyestes, who went into exile with his sons, and the city breathed again, relieved to have the matter settled, even by so uncanny a settlement. But Atreus was not finished. Betrayal had a taste he could not rinse from his mouth. That night he woke with the image of Thyestes and Erope tangled in his own bed, a knot that tightened the more he pulled at it. His mind, so clear in matters of rule and law, began to bend inward, circling the wound, pressing it, making it fresh each time he touched it. The net was already forming in his thoughts, not yet woven but visible, strand by strand, in the pattern of his days. Years passed, or perhaps only seasons. Grief makes time its own country. Atreus sent word to Thyestes that he wished for reconciliation. Let the past be forgotten. The message said, let brothers be brothers again. Come home and bring your sons, and let us feast together as our father would have wished. Thyestes, weary of exile, or hopeful for his children's futures, or simply caught in the gravity that pulls the cursed back toward the place of cursing, came. Atreus welcomed him with every sign of warmth. The palace was hung with garlands. The altars were piled with offerings. A great feast was prepared, the tables laden with the best the storerooms could offer. The brothers embraced before the household, and the people of Mycenae, who love a reconciliation as much as they love a grievance, murmured approval. They sat at table, Atreus and Thyestes, with the hearth between them and the gods watching, as gods watch, with interest but not intervention. The dishes came forth one by one, rich with savor, and Thyestes ate. He praised the preparation, the seasoning, the tenderness of the meat. He drank the wine his brother poured for him. He felt, perhaps, a lightness, the easing of the long knot of exile. When the meal was finished, Atreus rose. He spoke to the household, a speech about forgiveness and blood, and the duties that bind a family. Then he turned to Thyestes and gestured to the servants, who brought forth a covered platter and set it before the guest. Atreus lifted the cover. Inside were the heads and hands of Thyestes' sons. There are silences that ring louder than screams. Thyestes looked down at what had been brought to him. An understanding came slowly, each piece falling into place like stones laid for a tomb. The meat he had eaten, the savor he had praised, the tenderness, his own children, butchered and cooked and served to him, and he had consumed them, taken them into his body, made them part of his flesh again, in a way that mocked every bond of parent and child, host and guest, man and man. He did not weep. Weeping was too small. He rose from the table, his face white as bone, and the words that came from him were not a curse in the usual sense, not a cry for divine punishment. They were colder than that. They were a prophecy spoken with the certainty of a man who has seen the pattern and knows how the thread must run. "Let this house devour itself," Thyestes said, or the words were something near to that, in a tongue half prayer and half malediction. "Let son rise against father, wife against husband. Let blood answer blood until the walls themselves are sick with it. Let no generation rest. Let the table be overturned, and the hearth go cold, and the gates stand open to let the darkness in." Then he gathered the remains of his children and went out into the night, and Mycenae did not see him again. But one son had been absent from the feast. Aegisthus was a child still, too young to travel, left behind with a servant when Thyestes answered his brother's invitation. Or the story was darker. Aegisthus was the son Thyestes had fathered on his own daughter, Pelopia, in a night of horror and confusion, a thread of the curse folding back upon itself. Either way, he lived. He grew in secret places, fed on the knowledge of what Atreus had done, and when he was old enough to hold a sword, he held it with a single purpose. Atreus, for his part, believed the matter finished. He ruled Mycenae with a hand that was firm, and sometimes just, and always watchful. He married again and fathered sons. Agamemnon, broad-shouldered and keen for honor, and Menelaus, steadier, less consumed by the need to be greatest. The palace flourished. Alliances were made with other kingdoms. The flocks multiplied. The granaries filled. If the king sometimes woke in the dark and thought he heard footsteps in the halls or saw shadows that moved against the direction of the lamps, he told no one. The people of Mycenae learned not to speak of Thyestes. His name became a gap in conversation, a silence shaped like shame. The golden fleece was locked away again, this time in the innermost treasury, where no hand could reach it, and no eye profane it. The lamb that had borne it was long dead, its bones scattered, but the fleece remained, a reminder that favor, once torn from its rightful place, becomes a wound that does not close. In the women's quarters of the palace, where the looms clacked and the wool piled soft in baskets, the servants sometimes sang old songs. One song spoke of a lion cub brought into the house as a pet, nursed at a woman's breast, playful and gentle while it was young. The children loved it. The household delighted in its antics. But as it grew, its nature declared itself. One day it turned on those who had fed it, and the halls ran red, and the singers shook their heads and said, "So it is with what we welcome, unthinking, into our homes." Another song spoke of two eagles, magnificent and terrible, stooping together upon a hare heavy with young. They tore the hare apart in the sky, and the unborn children spilled out and fell to the earth, and the singer's voice dropped low and mournful, asking what harvest would come from such a hunt, what price the hunters would pay for prey taken out of season. The songs were old, older perhaps than the throne of Mycenae, but in the palace of Atreus they found new meaning. The women glanced at one another as they sang, and the younger ones, who did not yet know the full weight of the stories, felt a shiver they could not name. Agamemnon grew tall and strong, a young man shaped for command. He learned the ways of war and council, the rhetoric that moves assemblies and the silence that makes men uneasy. His father looked at him and saw the future of the house, or a future at least, one in which the throne passed cleanly and the city prospered. Menelaus beside him was the loyal shadow, less brilliant but no less essential, the brother who could be trusted to hold what was given him. It was Menelaus who went to Sparta and won the hand of Helen, the daughter of Zeus, whose beauty was a snare set by gods for purposes mortals could not guess. When he brought her home, even the stones of Mycenae seemed to hold their breath. Agamemnon looked at his brother's bride and felt something turn over in his chest. Not desire, though she was lovely beyond measure, but a recognition that fate had entered the house wearing mortal form, and that nothing would be simple again. Agamemnon himself married Clytemnestra, Helen's sister, a woman of different temper. Where Helen was the bright surface of water, Clytemnestra was the depth beneath, cold and clear and patient. She came to Mycenae as a queen, not a bride, and she moved through the halls with a certainty that made the servants step aside. She bore Agamemnon children, Iphigenia, bright-eyed and quick, Electra, watchful even as a babe, Orestes, the boy who laughed easily and had not yet learned what it meant to be a son of Atreus. The palace filled with the noise of children, the running of small feet on stone, the shouts and games and occasional tears that are the music of a house at peace. For a few years it seemed the curse had forgotten them, or had spent itself, or had never been more than a story told to explain the ordinary failures of men. But in the treasury the golden fleece lay folded, and in the hills beyond the city Aegisthus waited, and in the gods' high halls where time is not measured as mortals measure it, the pattern was already drawn, the net already woven, waiting only for the hand that would lift it and the moment when it would fall. One night, Clytemnestra dreamed. In the dream she stood in the great hall of the palace, and the floor was covered with a cloth of deepest crimson, rich and soft as blood still wet. Agamemnon walked upon it, his feet leaving no mark, and as he walked, the cloth stretched out before him, endless, a path that led into shadow. She tried to call to him, to warn him, but her voice made no sound. When she looked down, she saw that her own hands were tangled in the threads of the cloth, and that the threads were tightening, and that she could not let go. She woke in darkness and lay still, listening to her husband's breathing beside her. Outside, the wind moved through the courtyard. A dog barked once, then fell silent. The night was very deep. Clytemnestra rose and went to the window. Far off, beyond the city walls, she thought she saw a light, small and cold, like a torch carried by someone walking alone. She watched it for a long time. It did not come closer, but it did not go away. In the morning, she said nothing of the dream or the light. She went about the duties of the day, overseeing the household, settling disputes among the servants, speaking with the stewards about the stores and the coming season. Agamemnon was in the council chamber, hearing petitions, rendering judgments. Iphigenia played in the sunlight with her nurse. Electra sat in the women's hall, already learning the first stitches of the loom. Orestes, still small enough to be lifted, clung to his mother's skirts when she passed. The palace was golden in the morning light, strong and fair, a place where kings were made, and justice pronounced, and the gods honored with due sacrifice. But Clytemnestra, moving through the familiar rooms, felt the dream still clinging to her skin, like a garment she could not remove. That evening, as the household gathered for the meal, a stranger came to the gate. He was young, or seemed young, with eyes that were old. He asked for hospitality, and the laws of Zeus Xenios, protector of guests, required that he be admitted. He was given water to wash the dust from his feet, a place at table, bread and wine. He said his name was Aegisthus. The name meant nothing to most of those present, but Agamemnon, seated at the head of the table with his wife beside him, went very still. Clytemnestra looked at her husband and saw his face close like a fist. "You are welcome," Agamemnon said, "because the forms must be observed, and because a king does not show fear before his household. Eat and be at peace under this roof." Aegisthus inclined his head. "I am grateful for your kindness," he said, and his voice was soft, almost gentle. "I have traveled far to see the house of Atreus. My father spoke of it often." "And who was your father?" Clytemnestra asked, not knowing why the question rose, only that it drew itself from her. Aegisthus smiled. It was not a cruel smile, which somehow made it worse. "His name was Thyestes," he said. The torches seemed to gutter, though there was no wind. Somewhere in the back of the hall, a servant dropped a cup, and the sound of it breaking was sharp as a cry. Agamemnon rose. His hand did not go to his sword. There were laws and rituals, and the presence of the gods who watch what men do in their halls. But his whole body was a coiled readiness. "My father's brother," he said slowly, "long absent from this place." "Dead," Aegisthus said. "He died in exile, as you might expect. But before he died, he told me stories. He was a great teller of stories, my father. He told me about a feast, and a table, and a kindness that was not kind." No one moved. The household seemed frozen, caught between breath and breath. "He told me," Aegisthus continued, still in that soft voice, "that the house of Atreus has a long memory, and I thought, perhaps I too should remember. Perhaps I should come and see the place where my father's grief was made." Clytemnestra felt the threads tighten around her hands, though she stood in the waking world, and the dream was hours behind her. "You have eaten our bread," Agamemnon said. "For tonight you are protected. In the morning you will leave." Aegisthus bowed. "Of course, I would not abuse your hospitality." He looked around the hall, at the children seated near their mother, at the servants standing along the walls, at the high ceiling with its painted beams. "It is a beautiful house," he said. "I can see why men fight to keep it." He said nothing more that night. He ate sparingly, drank less, and when the meal was done, he accepted the pallet that was offered him in the guest quarters and lay down as though to sleep. But Clytemnestra, in the private chamber she shared with her husband, sat by the lamp and did not sleep at all. Agamemnon paced, 3 steps to the window and 3 steps back, his shadow huge on the wall. "He cannot stay," Agamemnon said. "You have given him guest right. For one night. In the morning he goes. And if he does not go far—" Clytemnestra turned to look at her husband. "If he waits, just beyond the gates, and watches." Agamemnon stopped pacing. "Then I will deal with him, as your father dealt with Thyestes." The words hung between them, cold and bright. Agamemnon's face darkened, but he did not answer. After a moment he turned away, and Clytemnestra knew that he too saw the net forming, the threads pulling taut, the pattern that had been set so long ago by men who thought they could escape consequence. In the morning, Aegisthus thanked them courteously and left. He went out through the lion gate, walking slowly, pausing once to look back at the palace with its great walls and its smoke rising from the altars. Then he was gone, swallowed by the hills and the morning mist. But he did not go far. He found a place in the countryside, a village that asked no questions, and there he stayed, patient as a hunter, watching the road that led to Mycenae, waiting for the moment that would come, as he knew it would come, because the house of Atreus was built on a foundation of blood, and blood calls to blood until the debt is paid. Inside the palace, life continued. Agamemnon ruled. Clytemnestra managed the household. The children grew. The seasons turned. But something had shifted. Some balance had tilted, and those who were sensitive to such things, the old women who tended the altars, the servants who had been in the house since the time of Atreus, felt it and murmured to one another in the dark. The net was no longer merely a shape in a dream or a metaphor in a song. It was real, invisible, woven from choices made and unmade, from curses spoken and silences kept, from the weight of history pressing down on the present. It hung above the house of Atreus, waiting to fall. And far to the west, where the sea met the edge of the world, storm clouds were gathering. Ships would soon gather in a harbor called Aulis, waiting for wind. A city called Troy would burn. A girl not yet grown would stand on a threshold between breath and stillness, and her death would be the knot that pulled the net closed around them all. But that was still to come. For now, the palace stood golden in the sun. The children laughed, and Clytemnestra sat at her loom, weaving, her fingers sure and quick, as though she had always known the pattern she was making. The news came to Mycenae in the way that news of great matters comes, first as rumor, then as certainty, then as summons. Paris, son of Priam, had taken Helen from Sparta. The words traveled through the palace like cold water, seeping through stone. She had gone with him, or been taken, depending on who spoke and what they wished to believe. across the wine-dark sea to Troy, that city of high walls and wealth beyond measuring. Menelaus had been absent, attending funeral games in Crete, and when he returned to find his house empty of the woman who had been its center, his grief became the grief of all Achaea. So the singers would have it. But Clytemnestra, hearing the news in the women's hall where such tidings arrived, filtered through layers of report and interpretation, felt something more complicated than sympathy. She had known Helen since they were girls together, before either had been chosen for marriage, before beauty and fate had bent their lives into shapes they had not selected. Helen had always been the one toward whom eyes turned, the still center of attention, and she had borne it with a peculiar grace, as though aware that her loveliness was not entirely her own, but something the gods had lent her for purposes she could not control. Now that loan had been called in, and Menelaus wept, and the kings of Achaea began to gather. Agamemnon received the summons with something that looked like eagerness. He had been restless since Aegisthus's visit, pacing the halls, snapping at servants, finding fault with matters that had never troubled him before. The prospect of war seemed to settle him, giving shape to energies that had been turning inward, souring. He sent messages to the other kings, to Odysseus of Ithaca, to Diomedes of Argos, to Nestor of Pylos, whose memory stretched back to the time of heroes now half forgotten. An oath had been sworn years before, when Helen was still unwed, and her many suitors threatened to tear Achaea apart in competition for her hand. They had all promised to defend the marriage, whoever won her. Now that promise must be kept. The ships would gather at Aulis, on the narrow strait where the wind funnels between the mainland and the long island that guards the eastern sea. From there, the fleet would sail to Troy and bring Helen home, or punish the taking, or, and this was spoken more quietly, claim glory and plunder enough to make the expedition worthwhile regardless of its stated purpose. Clytemnestra watched her husband arm himself with the determination of a man who has found his true calling. He called for his finest bronze, his boar tusk helmet, his shield with its intricate devices. He consulted with the armorer about spear shafts and sword hilts. He spent long hours in the treasury, calculating how much wealth could be spared for the campaign, how many ships Mycenae could furnish, how large a contingent would declare his status as first among the kings. "You are eager for this," Clytemnestra said one evening, when they were alone in the chamber and the children had been put to bed. Agamemnon looked up from the map he had been studying, a chart of coastlines and harbors drawn on parchment, so old the edges crumbled at a touch. "It is necessary. Many things are necessary. Not all of them are welcomed." He set down the map and looked at her, and for a moment she saw something flicker in his face, defensiveness, or perhaps uncertainty. Then it was gone, replaced by the expression he wore in council, the mask of command. "My brother has been wronged. The oath binds us, and Troy has grown too proud, too rich. It will be good for Achaea to stand together, to remember that we are one people when we choose to be." "And the house? Who will hold it while you are gone?" "You will hold it," Agamemnon said, "as you have always held it. You are more than capable." It was true, and they both knew it. Clytemnestra had been ruling Mycenae in all but name for years, managing the estates, settling disputes, ensuring that the granaries were filled, and the flocks accounted for. Agamemnon was king, but she was the hand that kept the household turning. Still, there was something in the ease with which he said it, "You will hold it," that struck her as dismissal rather than trust. "How long will you be gone?" she asked. He shrugged. "A season, perhaps. 2. Troy is strong, but we will be stronger. The gods favor our cause." Clytemnestra wanted to ask which gods, and how he knew, but she held the questions back. Instead, she said, "The children will miss you. They will understand. Orestes must learn that a king's duty is not always to his own comfort. And the girls." He paused, and a softness came into his voice. "Tell Iphigenia that I will bring her a gift from Troy, something fine." Iphigenia was his favorite, though he tried not to show it. She had his quickness, his clarity of purpose, and a joy in living that neither Electra nor Orestes quite matched. She was approaching the age when she would begin to learn the tasks of a woman, the weaving and household management, but she still ran through the halls like a child, laughing, curious about everything. "I will tell her," Clytemnestra said. The preparations consumed the palace. Supplies were gathered, weapons sharpened, ships made ready in the harbor far below the citadel. Agamemnon chose his men carefully, veterans who had fought in smaller campaigns, young men eager to prove themselves, a few who came because loyalty or debt required it. He took with him also the seer Calchas, a man whose eyes seemed always to be looking at something just beyond the visible world, and whose pronouncements were sufficiently ambiguous that they could be interpreted to fit whatever outcome arrived. On the morning he was to leave, the household gathered in the courtyard to see him off. It was early, the sun just clearing the eastern hills, and the air was cool with the last breath of night. Clytemnestra stood with the children beside her, Iphigenia grave and trying to be brave, Electra silent and watchful, Orestes clutching at his mother's hand, with a fierceness that suggested he understood more than his years should allow. Agamemnon embraced them, each in turn, his movements formal, as though he were already half gone, his mind on the road ahead. When he came to Clytemnestra, he placed his hands on her shoulders and looked into her face. "Keep the house safe," he said. "I will. And if anything should happen, if there is threat or trouble, send word. I will return." "Nothing will happen," Clytemnestra said, though she did not believe it, and from the look in his eyes, neither did he. Then he was gone, riding down the long road that led from the citadel to the plain, his men trailing behind him in a column of bronze and dust. The children waved until he was out of sight, and then Iphigenia began to cry, quietly, and Clytemnestra gathered her close and felt the weight of the house settle onto her shoulders like a mantle she had not asked to wear. The days that followed were strange. The palace, so full of Agamemnon's presence even when he was silent, seemed larger and emptier. Clytemnestra moved through it as she always had, attending to the endless details that kept a great household functioning. But she felt herself drifting, unmoored. At night she dreamed of the crimson cloth again, the path that led into shadow, and woke with the sense that she had been trying to say something important, but could not remember the words. News came irregularly. Agamemnon had reached Aulis. The fleet was gathering, ships from Ithaca, from Pylos, from Argos and Sparta, and a dozen smaller kingdoms. Thousands of men, a forest of masts, the greatest assembly of Achaean power in a generation. The reports were triumphant in tone, full of confidence and anticipation. Troy would fall swiftly, the messengers said. Not even the gods could stand against such a host. But then the messages stopped. Weeks passed with no word. The household grew uneasy. Servants whispered in corners. The children asked when their father would send letters. And Clytemnestra, who had no answer, told them he was busy with the preparations, that they must be patient. Finally, a messenger arrived. He was dusty and exhausted, and he asked to speak to the queen privately. Clytemnestra received him in the small chamber where she conducted the business of the estate, and she knew before he spoke that the news was not what they had been expecting. "The fleet is becalmed," the messenger said. "At Aulis, the wind will not come." Clytemnestra considered this. How long? Weeks now, perhaps a month. The men grow restless. Some ships have already left, their captains unwilling to wait longer. King Agamemnon has held the rest together, but it is difficult. What do the seers say? The messenger hesitated. Calchas has pronounced that the goddess Artemis is angry. He says she holds the wind in her hand and will not release it until... He stopped. Until what? Until a sacrifice is made. The man's face was carefully neutral, but a tightness in his voice made Clytemnestra's stomach clench. What sacrifice? He has not said, my lady, or if he has said, the king has not shared it. Clytemnestra dismissed the messenger and sat alone in the chamber as the light faded outside the narrow window. A sacrifice. The word had weight, a specificity that could not be ignored. Artemis was the goddess of wild things, of boundaries and thresholds, of the hunt that respects its prey. If she was angry, it was because some boundary had been crossed, some proper order violated. But what order, and by whom? She thought of Agamemnon pacing at Aulis, watching the flat sea, feeling the eyes of the other kings on him. He was the leader of the expedition, the one who had called them together. If the fleet could not sail, the failure was his. Men would begin to doubt. Alliances would fray. The great enterprise would collapse before it had even begun, and with it, Agamemnon's authority, his status, perhaps even his hold on the throne of Mycenae. What would he do, she wondered, to prevent that collapse? The answer came not as thought, but as knowing, cold and certain. He would do what men of his house had always done. He would find a way to pay the price, whatever it was, and he would call it necessity. Another week passed. Clytemnestra went about her duties with a sense of walking through water, each movement slower than it should be, each word requiring more effort. She watched Iphigenia at her lessons, learning to spin wool into thread, her young fingers clumsy but determined. She listened to Orestes recite the lineages of heroes, his voice high and serious. She sat with Electra in the evening while the girl worked at her weaving, already more skilled than her older sister, her patterns tight and even. The second messenger arrived at nightfall. He was a different man, younger, and he carried a sealed letter with Agamemnon's mark. Clytemnestra took it to her chamber and broke the seal with fingers that did not quite shake. The letter was brief. Agamemnon's hand was clear, the letters carefully formed, as though he had taken time with each word. The wind is still contrary. The seer has spoken. A marriage is required to appease the goddess. Send Iphigenia to Aulis. Tell her she is to be wed to Achilles, hero of the Myrmidons, greatest of the Achaean warriors. Make haste. The fleet cannot wait much longer." Clytemnestra read the letter twice, then a third time, as though repetition might change the words or reveal some meaning she had missed. A marriage, Achilles, the greatest warrior, young and favored by the gods. It was a brilliant match, the kind that would secure alliances and elevate the house of Atreus even further. But the timing was wrong. The haste was wrong. And underneath the surface of the words, Clytemnestra felt the shape of something else, a hollowness, as though the letter itself were a shell concealing an absence. She stood at the window and looked out at the stars, cold and distant and indifferent. Artemis was the goddess of maidens, the protector of girls on the threshold of womanhood. What would such a goddess demand as sacrifice? The answer was there, waiting. But Clytemnestra could not yet reach for it. To reach for it would be to make it real, and once it was real, she would have to act. Instead, she folded the letter carefully and placed it in the chest where she kept important documents. Then she went to the household shrine, where a small altar stood with offerings of oil and grain, and she poured a libation to Artemis, goddess of the crossroads, and prayed for clarity. The goddess did not answer. They so rarely do, except in dreams or through the mouths of seers, and even then the answers are shaped like riddles. In the morning, Clytemnestra called for the steward and gave orders for a journey. Iphigenia would go to Aulis, accompanied by a proper escort and carrying gifts suitable for a royal wedding. The household received the news with excitement. A marriage to Achilles. The girl was fortunate beyond measure. The servants bustled about, preparing clothes, packing chests, debating what jewels should be sent, what fabrics, what tokens of the bride's family. Iphigenia herself was radiant with surprise and confusion, and a tentative joy. She sought out her mother in the women's hall, her face bright. "Is it true? Am I really to marry Achilles?" Clytemnestra looked at her daughter and felt something crack inside her chest, a small fracture that would widen with time. "Your father has arranged it. He thinks it is a good match. I have heard the songs about Achilles. They say he is the swiftest of the Achaeans and the bravest. They say he is half divine. Songs say many things." Iphigenia tilted her head, puzzled by her mother's tone. "Are you not pleased?" "I am pleased if you are pleased," Clytemnestra said, and it was not a lie, or not entirely. She was pleased that her daughter still had joy, still trusted, still believed that the world was a place where marriages were made, and songs sung, and heroes kept their promises. The preparations took 3 days. On the morning of departure, Clytemnestra stood in the courtyard and watched the carts being loaded. Iphigenia was dressed in her finest, a robe dyed the color of saffron, her hair braided and bound with ribbons. She looked older than her years, poised on the edge of transformation, and Clytemnestra felt time collapse, saw the infant she had nursed, and the woman her daughter would never become, existing in the same moment. "Take care of her," Clytemnestra said to the captain of the escort, a man named Arcas, who had served the house since before Agamemnon took the throne. "With my life, my lady. See that she reaches the king safely. Do not leave her side." Arcas bowed. Something in his face suggested he, too, felt the wrongness, the haste, the gaps in the story. But he was a soldier, and soldiers follow orders. Iphigenia embraced her mother, her body warm and solid, still smelling of the olive oil soap she had used that morning. "I will send word as soon as I arrive," she said, "and when I am married, you must come to visit. Achilles will want to meet you." "I will come," Clytemnestra said, and the lie tasted like ashes. Then the carts were moving, the horses stepping carefully over the stones, and Iphigenia was waving from the back of the lead cart, her face still bright, still trusting. Clytemnestra stood and watched until the procession disappeared down the road, swallowed by distance and the dust that rose behind them like a veil. Electra, standing beside her mother, said quietly, "She will not come back, will she?" Clytemnestra looked down at her daughter, at the dark eyes that saw too much, too soon. "Why do you say that?" "Because you are crying, and you never cry." Clytemnestra raised her hand to her face and found it wet. She had not known. "Go inside," she said, not harshly. "Look after your brother." Electra hesitated, then obeyed, and Clytemnestra was alone in the courtyard, with the servants returning to their tasks and the day stretching ahead like an empty road. She returned to her chamber and took out Agamemnon's letter and read it again. The words had not changed, but now she read them as they were written, in the language of power rather than the language of family. A marriage is required to appease the goddess. Not a celebration, not a joining of houses, a requirement, an appeasement. Iphigenia was not going to be married, she was going to die. The knowing came complete, cold and clear as spring water. Calchas had demanded a sacrifice. Artemis would not release the wind without blood. And Agamemnon, first among kings, leader of the great expedition, had chosen to pay the price with his daughter's life. Because the alternative was to fail, to lose authority, to come home diminished and shamed. Clytemnestra stood very still. The fracture in her chest widened, became a chasm. On one side was the woman who had been queen of Mycenae, wife of Agamemnon, mother and keeper of the house. On the other side was something new, not yet fully formed, cold and patient and irrevocable. She could send riders after the escort. She could overtake them, bring Iphigenia home, refuse the summons. But to do so would be to defy Agamemnon publicly, to break the chain of command that held the household together. The other kings would hear of it. Agamemnon would be humiliated. The fleet would dissolve, or worse, Agamemnon would find another way to pay the price, and the cost might fall on all of them. Or she could do nothing. She could let the escort continue to Aulis, let Agamemnon make his choice, and live with the knowledge that she had been complicit by inaction. There was a third option, but it was not yet visible, not yet speakable. It moved in the shadows at the edge of her thought, patient as the figure that walks alone, carrying a torch that neither approaches nor recedes. Clytemnestra folded the letter a final time and placed it back in the chest. Then she went to the household shrine and made an offering, not to Artemis this time, but to the older gods, the ones whose names are not spoken in daylight, the ones who hear prayers made in anger and grief, and the cold clarity that comes when trust has been burned away. She did not pray for Iphigenia's safety. It was too late for that, and she was not a woman who wasted words on prayers the gods would not grant. Instead, she prayed for memory, for steadiness, for the ability to wait. And underneath the prayer was a promise, not spoken but felt, a thread beginning to weave itself into a pattern she could not yet see whole. The days after Iphigenia's departure were quiet. The household moved around Clytemnestra as though she were a stone in a stream, necessary but separate. She attended to her duties with the same efficiency as always, but something in her had withdrawn to a place where no one could reach. Electra watched her mother with the intensity of a child who knows that the world has shifted, but does not yet understand how. Orestes, younger, felt it only as unease, and clung more tightly to his nurse, waking at night with dreams he could not describe. Clytemnestra sat at her loom in the evenings, working by lamplight, and the pattern she wove was red and black, intricate and tight, the threads pulling taut under her fingers. She did not think about what the pattern represented. She only wove, following the lines as they appeared, trusting that the design would reveal itself when it was finished. The third messenger came after 2 weeks. He was not a soldier, but a priest, an old man with a staff and a face carved by years of speaking uncomfortable truths. He did not carry a letter. He came only to deliver a message, and he delivered it standing in the courtyard, with the household gathered around him, because there was no way to speak such words privately. The goddess has been appeased, the priest said. The wind has come, the fleet has sailed. Clytemnestra stood on the steps of the hall, her hands folded before her, her face as still as carved stone. "And my daughter?" The priest met her eyes, and in his gaze was the sorrow of a man who has seen too many such moments, who knows that truth is a blade that cuts regardless of how gently it is offered. She was given to Artemis. The king himself led her to the altar. She went willingly, they say, when she understood what was required. She died with courage. The words fell into the courtyard like stones into still water, and the ripples spread outward, touching every person present. Servants gasped. One of the older women began to wail. Electra made a sound that was not quite a cry, and Orestes, not understanding, asked in a high, frightened voice, "Where is Iphigenia? When is she coming home?" Clytemnestra did not move. She stood on the steps and felt the last thread of the old pattern snap. The connection between herself and the man who had been her husband, severing as cleanly as though cut with a knife. "Thank you," she said to the priest, her voice perfectly level. "You have fulfilled your duty. The household will provide you food and rest before you return." The priest bowed and withdrew, and the servants, uncertain, began to disperse, murmuring to one another, seeking the comfort of familiar tasks. Electra remained standing in the courtyard, her face white, her hands clenched at her sides. Orestes had begun to cry, and his nurse gathered him up and carried him away, murmuring soothing nonsense. Clytemnestra descended the steps and crossed to where Electra stood. She placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, and the girl looked up at her with eyes that had suddenly aged. "He killed her?" Electra whispered. "Father killed Iphigenia." "Yes. Why?" "Because he valued his glory more than her life." The words were simple, brutal, true. Electra stared at her mother, and Clytemnestra saw the child beginning to choose, allegiance forming in the space where innocence had been. "I will never forgive him," Electra said. "That is your right. Will you?" Clytemnestra looked down at her daughter and felt the new pattern locking into place, the design clear at last, red and black, blood and shadow, the loom of vengeance. "No," she said, "I will not forgive him. and he'll learn what it costs to take a child from its mother." She spoke quietly, almost gently, but the words had the weight of an oath. Electra heard it and nodded, and in that moment an alliance was formed, fragile and terrible, between mother and daughter, founded on grief and the cold clarity of anger that has been refined into purpose. In the hills beyond Mycenae, Aegisthus heard the news from a traveler passing through the village where he had made his temporary home. Iphigenia, daughter of Agamemnon, sacrificed at Aulis so that the fleet might sail. The traveler told the story with a kind of relish, the way men do when speaking of others' tragedies, finding in them confirmation that the world is as brutal as they have always suspected. Aegisthus listened and said nothing, but that night he stood outside his dwelling and looked toward the distant lights of Mycenae, and he thought about patterns and debts and the way that blood calls to blood across generations. Atreus had killed his brother's sons and served them to their father. Now Agamemnon had killed his daughter and called it necessity. The house devoured its own, just as Thyestes had said it would. Aegisthus had been patient. He had waited because waiting was required, because vengeance taken too soon is clumsy and fails. But now the moment was approaching. He could feel it in the air, in the way the wind moved through the hills, in the silence that followed the traveler's departure. The king was gone to war, and the queen was alone, and grief was a door that could be opened if one knew how to knock. Aegisthus began to make his preparations. He would return to Mycenae, not as a guest this time, but as something else. A comfort, perhaps, or an ally, or simply a presence in the house when presence was what the queen most needed. He would be patient still, careful, attuned to the rhythms of her grief. He would not force. He would only wait and offer, and let the pattern weave itself as it was always going to weave. In the palace, Clytemnestra sat at her loom, long into the night, her fingers moving steadily, the shuttle passing back and forth, red thread and black, blood and shadow, the cloth growing under her hands. She did not weep. Weeping was for those who still believed that grief could be softened by expression. She was past that now, in a place where feeling had been distilled into knowing, and knowing into will. The net was forming. The threads were drawing tight. And when Agamemnon returned, victor or not, she would be ready. Outside, the wind moved through the empty courtyard, stirring the dust where Iphigenia had stood and waved goodbye. And in the darkness, something waited, patient and inevitable as the turning of the seasons, the justice that is older than law and colder than mercy. Grief has its own seasons, and they do not follow the calendar that governs harvest and planting. Clytemnestra moved through the first months after Iphigenia's death, with the surface of her life intact. She woke at dawn, as she had always done. She oversaw the household, settled disputes among the servants, received the stewards who came with reports of flocks and fields. She ensured that Electra continued her lessons at the loom, and that Orestes learned his letters from the old pedagogue who had taught Agamemnon when he was a boy. The palace functioned as it had always functioned, a great mechanism of routine and obligation, and she was its center, holding it steady. But those who knew her well, the older servants, the nurse who had attended her since she first came to Mycenae as a bride, saw the change. It was not in her actions, but in the space between them, the pauses that lasted a heartbeat too long, the way her gaze would fix on something distant and invisible. She had always been contained, careful with her words and her expressions. Now she was remote, as though she had withdrawn to some inner chamber and locked the door behind her. Electra felt the distance and did not know how to cross it. The girl had her own grief, raw and bewildering, and she sought her mother's comfort the way a plant seeks light. But Clytemnestra, though never unkind, offered only the surface of herself. She would embrace Electra when the child wept, would speak the words that custom required, but there was no warmth in it, no shared dissolution of sorrow. It was as though she had decided that grief must be borne alone, or perhaps that to share it would be to dilute the anger that lay beneath, and the anger must be kept pure. Orestes understood less, but felt more. He was still young enough that the world seemed subject to rearrangement, and he kept asking when Iphigenia would return, when their father would come home, whether the war was over yet. Clytemnestra answered him with patience, explaining again and again that Iphigenia would not return, that Agamemnon was far away and would be gone for a long time. But children do not accept such answers easily, and Orestes would ask again the next day or the next week, as though repetition might change the truth. At night, Clytemnestra dreamed. The crimson cloth appeared again and again, but now it was no longer a path. It was a shroud, vast and heavy, settling over the palace like snow that never melts. She would try to lift it, to pull it away from the doors and windows, but it clung to her hands, sticky and warm, and when she looked down, she saw that her fingers were stained red to the wrist. She woke from these dreams with her heart steady and her mind clear. There was no confusion about what they meant. The gods, or her own soul, or the pattern that ran through the house of Atreus like a seam in stone, was showing her what was coming. She accepted it. More than that, she began to prepare for it. The first preparation was knowledge. Clytemnestra called for the records of the household, the old tablets and scrolls that documented alliances, debts, marriages, feuds. She studied them by lamplight, tracing the lines of connection that bound Mycenae to the other kingdoms, the obligations given and received, the promises made. She learned which families had reason to resent Agamemnon, which had been passed over for honors or slighted in its division of spoils from earlier campaigns. She made note of who might be persuaded to look away when the time came, who might offer tacit support, who would need to be managed or appeased. She also began to pay closer attention to the reports from Aulis and, later, from Troy itself. Messengers came irregularly, sometimes weeks apart, bringing news of the war's progress. The fleet had reached the Trojan coast. The armies had landed and made camp. The Trojans had come out to meet them, and the first battles had been fought, inconclusive, bloody, the kind of skirmishing that settles nothing but uses up men and supplies. Troy's walls were high and strong, and the Achaeans had no siege engines capable of breaching them. It would be a long war, the messengers said, perhaps years. Clytemnestra listened to these reports and found in them a kind of bitter satisfaction. Agamemnon would be gone for years. The house would be hers to hold, to shape, and when he finally returned, if he returned, she would be ready. The second preparation was the household itself. Clytemnestra began, slowly and carefully, to shift the balance of loyalty within the palace. She promoted servants who showed particular devotion to her rather than to the memory of the absent king. She gave responsibilities to those who had daughters of their own, who understood what it meant to lose a child, who looked at her with sympathy that had hardened into something colder. She was not obvious about it. A word here, a favor there, the slow accumulation of small debts and gratitudes that over time would bind people to her cause. She also attended more carefully to the rituals. She made offerings at the household shrine, not only to the Olympians, but to the older powers, the ones who dwell beneath the earth and remember injuries across generations. She poured libations to the Erinyes, the Furies who pursue those who spill kindred blood, and she prayed that they would turn their attention where it was deserved. She was careful in these devotions. The powers she invoked were dangerous, not easily controlled, but she was past the point of seeking safety. It was during one of these offerings, late at night when the household slept, that she heard footsteps in the corridor outside the shrine. She set down the cup and turned to find Electra standing in the doorway, wrapped in a cloak against the night chill. "You should be asleep," Clytemnestra said. "I heard you moving." Electra stepped into the small room, her eyes adjusting to the lamplight. She looked at the altar, at the dark stains where wine had been poured, at her mother's hands still damp from the libation. "You are praying to the angry gods." It was not a question. Clytemnestra considered lying or deflecting, but she saw in her daughter's face the same hard clarity that had settled into her own. Electra was changing, the softness of childhood burning away like mist in sunlight. She deserved truth, or at least a portion of it. "I am praying for justice," Clytemnestra said, "against father." "Yes." Electra was silent for a moment, her face pale in the dim light. Then she said, "May I pray with you?" Clytemnestra felt something shift in her chest, not warmth exactly, but a recognition, a kinship she had not expected. She held out her hand, and Electra came forward and knelt beside her mother at the altar. Together they poured wine onto the stone and spoke the old words, the invocations that call on powers older than Zeus, older than justice as the bright gods define it. When they were finished, Electra looked up at her mother and said, "When he comes back, what will you do? What must be done? Will you kill him?" The word hung between them, stark and unadorned. Clytemnestra did not flinch from it. "If the gods allow it." Electra nodded slowly. "I will help you. You are still a child. I am old enough to hate." Clytemnestra looked at her daughter and saw the cost of what she was building, the way her own anger was being passed down like inheritance, shaping Electra into something fierce and inflexible. She should have felt guilt or sorrow, or the instinct to protect that mothers are supposed to carry. But she felt only a cold approval, the recognition that in this work she would not be alone. "Go back to bed," she said gently. "We have time yet." Electra obeyed, but before she left she turned back and said, "Orestes must not know. He is too young, and he loved father." "I know." When the girl was gone, Clytemnestra sat in the shrine a while longer, listening to the silence of the palace. The lamplight flickered against the walls, casting shadows that moved like living things. She thought about Orestes, her son, who still believed that his father was a hero fighting a just war, who waited for Agamemnon's return with a child's uncomplicated joy. The boy would have to be managed, protected from the truth, until it was too late to change it. She would be taking his father from him, just as Agamemnon had taken Iphigenia from her. The symmetry of it was clean, almost beautiful, but it would leave scars. She rose and extinguished the lamp, then made her way through the dark corridors to her chamber. Sleep, when it came, was dreamless. Aegisthus returned to Mycenae in the 4th month after Iphigenia's death. He came quietly, without announcement, arriving at the gates in the early morning when the city was just waking. The guards recognized him from his previous visit and sent word to the palace, uncertain whether to admit him or turn him away. Clytemnestra, informed of his presence, considered for a long moment. She remembered the young man with old eyes, the son of Thyestes, the living embodiment of the curse that ran through the house of Atreus. She remembered how Agamemnon had paled at his name, how the household had tensed, as though in the presence of something dangerous. She could refuse him, send him away as Agamemnon had done, or she could let him in and see what he wanted, and perhaps find in him a tool that could be used. She sent word that he should be admitted and given a place in the outer hall. When she came down to meet him, Aegisthus was standing by one of the windows, looking out at the courtyard, where morning light slanted across the stones. He turned at her approach and bowed, the gesture respectful but not servile. "Lady Clytemnestra, I am grateful for your hospitality. You are bold to return here." Clytemnestra said, "My husband made it clear you were not welcome. Your husband is not here." Aegisthus met her eyes without challenge, but without submission either. "And I did not come to see him. I came to see you." "For what purpose?" "To offer my sympathy." He paused, and something in his expression shifted, became softer. "I heard about your daughter. I am sorry." Clytemnestra studied him, looking for calculation or mockery, but found neither. His sorrow seemed genuine, or at least as genuine as such a thing could be between strangers. "Why should you care about my grief?" "Because I know what it is to lose family to the ambitions of the house of Atreus." Aegisthus said quietly, "My father told me stories before he died, about a feast and a betrayal, and children killed for the sake of vengeance. I thought those stories were the worst things I would ever hear. Then I learned what Agamemnon did at Aulis, and I realized that the pattern repeats. The house devours its own, generation after generation." Clytemnestra said nothing, but she felt the truth of his words settle into her like a stone into deep water. She gestured to a bench. "Sit. Tell me why you are really here." Aegisthus sat, and she sat across from him, the space between them formal, careful. He was silent for a moment, as though choosing his words, and when he spoke, his voice was low, meant only for her. "I came because I think we might help each other." "In what way?" "You want justice for your daughter. I want justice for my brothers. Agamemnon stands in the way of both. He is the king. He is a murderer who calls himself a king." Aegisthus leaned forward slightly, and he is far away, fighting a war that may take years. By the time he returns, if he returns, much could change. Loyalties could shift. The household could be prepared. Clytemnestra looked at him steadily. "You are proposing alliance. I am proposing that we recognize the truth. We are both heirs to the curse of this house, and we both have reason to want it ended. or at least to want Agamemnon to pay for his part in perpetuating it. And what do you gain from this? Aegisthus smiled, thin and without humor. Vengeance, the satisfaction of seeing Atreus's line falter, and, if the gods permit it, perhaps a place in the world that is not defined entirely by exile and waiting. It was a dangerous proposal, the kind that could destroy her if it went wrong. To ally herself with Aegisthus was to step openly into the web of the curse, to become an active participant rather than a victim. But Clytemnestra had already made that choice. Alone in the shrine, pouring wine to the Erinyes, Aegisthus was simply offering to make the work easier, to provide a second hand in the weaving. "I will consider it," she said. Aegisthus nodded and rose. "That is all I ask. I will be staying in the city, at the house of a merchant who owes my family a debt. If you wish to speak further, you can send word there." He left without pressing further, and Clytemnestra sat alone in the hall for a long time after he was gone, thinking. The man was clever. That much was clear. He had approached her at precisely the right moment, when her grief was still fresh, but her resolve had hardened, when she was most likely to welcome an ally. He had offered sympathy without false warmth, alliance without pretending to affection. It was the approach of someone who understood power and how it is negotiated. She did not trust him, but trust was not required for alliance. Only shared interest and clarity about the terms. Over the following weeks, Clytemnestra sent for Aegisthus 3 times. Each meeting was brief, held in private, carefully arranged, so that the household would not remark on them. They spoke of practical matters, how to manage the loyalty of the guards, how to ensure that the key positions in the palace were held by those who would not resist when the moment came, how to control the flow of information from Troy, so that the city would not grow restless or begin to question Clytemnestra's authority. Aegisthus proved useful. He had contacts in the city, people who owed debts to his father's memory, or who bore their own grudges against Agamemnon. He could move through Mycenae without drawing attention, a familiar stranger, and he brought back information that Clytemnestra could not easily obtain on her own. Which merchants were prospering, which families were struggling, where the fault lines of loyalty ran beneath the surface of the city's life. Slowly, imperceptibly, the balance of the household shifted. Clytemnestra remained the visible authority, the queen who held the palace in her husband's absence. But beneath that surface, another structure was forming, a network of obligation and complicity that bound certain key people to her, and through her, to Aegisthus. It was during the 5th meeting, held in the small chamber where Clytemnestra kept the household records, that the nature of their alliance changed. They had been discussing the captain of the palace guard, an older man who had served Atreus and remained loyal to Agamemnon out of long habit. Aegisthus suggested that the captain be encouraged to retire, replaced with someone younger, someone whose loyalty could be purchased or cultivated. Clytemnestra agreed, and they began to plan the approach, the words that would be used, the pension that would be offered. As they spoke, Clytemnestra found herself watching Aegisthus more closely. He was younger than she, perhaps by 5 or 6 years, though his manner made him seem older. There was a stillness to him, a control that reminded her of herself. He did not waste words or gestures. He did not seek to charm or persuade through false warmth. He simply stated what he thought, and waited to see if she agreed, and when she did not, he adjusted without argument. It was restful, in a way, to work with someone who did not require the constant performance that most interactions demanded. With Aegisthus, she could speak plainly, without softening or apology, and he would meet her in that clarity. When the meeting was finished and Aegisthus rose to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at her. "You have done this before," he said. "Done what?" "Managed power from a position where you are not supposed to have it. You are better at it than most men I have known." It was not flattery, merely observation, but Clytemnestra felt a small warmth at the acknowledgement. Agamemnon had never spoken to her of such things, had never asked her counsel on matters of rule, had dismissed her work in managing the household as beneath the notice of kingship. Aegisthus saw it differently, or at least claimed to. "I do what is necessary," she said. "As do I." He left, and Clytemnestra sat for a while in the quiet of the chamber, aware that something had shifted. The alliance was no longer merely practical. There was, if not trust, then at least a recognition between them, a sense of being understood that she had not felt in a long time. She told herself it did not matter. Aegisthus was a tool, a means to an end. When Agamemnon was dead and justice satisfied, the alliance would end. She would rule Mycenae in her son's name, or perhaps find some other arrangement, but Aegisthus would not remain. He was too dangerous, too marked by the curse, too likely to bring ruin simply by his presence. But in the nights that followed, she found herself thinking about him more than the work required. She remembered the way he had looked at her when he spoke of her capability, the absence of condescension, the simple acknowledgement of her skill. She remembered his stillness, the way he listened without needing to fill silence with empty words. It was not desire, not yet, but it was the ground in which desire could grow, and Clytemnestra, who prided herself on clear sight, recognized the danger. The seasons turned. Summer gave way to autumn, and the reports from Troy continued to arrive, each one much like the last. The war ground on, a stalemate punctuated by occasional skirmishes and duels that settled nothing. Achilles had killed Hector, the greatest of the Trojan warriors, and the Achaeans had rejoiced. But the walls of Troy still stood, and the city showed no signs of surrender. Orestes turned a year older. He was learning to fight, practicing with a wooden sword under the instruction of a retired soldier, and he spoke constantly of the day when he would be old enough to join his father at Troy. Clytemnestra watched him and felt the weight of what she was planning settle more heavily on her shoulders. The boy adored Agamemnon, shaped his whole understanding of manhood around the image of the warrior king. When the truth came, it would break him. Electra, meanwhile, grew harder. She spent less time at play and more at the loom, her patterns growing more intricate, more disciplined. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her words were careful, chosen. She seemed to be practicing something, learning to control herself in preparation for a test she knew was coming. One evening, as winter approached and the days grew short, Clytemnestra found her daughter sitting alone in the women's hall, working at her weaving by lamplight. The pattern Electra was making was red and black, the colors of blood and mourning, and the design was a net, tight and geometric. Clytemnestra sat beside her and watched the shuttle move back and forth, the threads pulling taut. "You have learned quickly," she said. "You taught me well." They sat in silence for a while, and then Electra said, without looking up from her work, "When will it happen?" "When your father returns. And Aegisthus, he will help you." Clytemnestra felt a flicker of surprise. She had been careful to keep the meetings private, but clearly Electra had been watching, noticing. "Yes." "Do you love him?" The question was direct, shocking in its clarity. Clytemnestra considered how to answer. What truth could be spoken to a daughter learning the boundaries between child and woman? "I do not know," she said finally. "I value his help. I trust his hatred of your father. Beyond that, I do not know." Electra nodded, accepting this. "Orestes will not understand. No, he will hate you. Yes, I will not." Electra looked up at last, her young face solemn, ancient with knowledge she should not yet possess. "I will stand with you, whatever comes." Clytemnestra reached out and placed her hand over her daughter's, feeling the warmth of the skin, the delicate bones beneath. "You may regret that choice. I know." They returned to their work, the mother and daughter weaving side by side, the patterns forming under their hands, red and black, blood and shadow, the net that would fall when the time came. Outside, winter began to settle over Mycenae. The wind came down from the mountains, cold and sharp, and the sky grew gray. The flocks were brought in from the high pastures. The granaries were sealed. The palace, always imposing, seemed to draw inward, becoming a fortress against the dark season. Aegisthus continued his visits, always discreet, always careful. He and Clytemnestra spoke less of practical arrangements now, and more of the broader pattern, the history of the house, the ways that violence had been answered with violence across generations. They traced the line from Tantalus to Pelops, to Atreus, to Agamemnon, seeing how each act of betrayal or cruelty had set the stage for the next. "It will not end with Agamemnon's death," Aegisthus said during one of these conversations. "The curse runs too deep." "Then what would end it?" "I do not know if it can be ended. Perhaps only exhausted, when there is no one left to carry it forward." Clytemnestra thought of Orestes, innocent and eager, and Electra, fierce and already marked. "Then we are condemning our children." "We were condemned before we were born," Aegisthus said. "The choice is only whether to accept it passively or to act, to claim some measure of agency even within the curse." It was a bleak philosophy, but Clytemnestra found herself agreeing. She had felt the weight of the pattern all her life, the sense that her choices were not entirely her own, that she was moving through a story already written. But she could at least choose the manner of her movement, the dignity or savagery with which she played her part. As winter deepened, something shifted between Clytemnestra and Aegisthus. The conversations grew longer, less focused on practicalities. They began to speak of other things, the books they had read, the songs they remembered from childhood, the moments of beauty or strangeness that had marked their lives. These were small intimacies, easily dismissed, but they accumulated like snow, building a structure neither had intended. One night, after a particularly long meeting, Aegisthus did not leave immediately. They stood in the doorway of the chamber, and the silence between them was different from the silences that had come before. Clytemnestra felt it, the shift, the possibility. "I should go," Aegisthus said, but he did not move. Yes, he looked at her, and in his eyes She saw the same recognition she felt, that they were past the point of simple alliance, that something else was forming, dangerous and inevitable. "If we do this," he began. "I know," Clytemnestra interrupted. "It will complicate everything. It will give our enemies a weapon. It will make the act, when it comes, seem sordid rather than just. Yes, and yet. They stood in that threshold a moment longer, and then Aegisthus reached out and touched her face very gently, a question rather than a claim. Clytemnestra closed her eyes and allowed it, and in that allowance the last barrier fell. What followed was not the passion of songs or stories. It was careful, deliberate, two people stepping into alliance of a different kind, seeking in each other not escape, but confirmation, the recognition that they were not alone in their anger or their purpose. They came together in the cold season, in the dark of the palace, and found in each other a warmth that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with the shared burden of vengeance. Afterward, lying in the darkness, Clytemnestra felt no guilt. She had been faithful to Agamemnon for years, not out of affection but out of duty, the obligations of marriage and position. He had broken those obligations when he killed Iphigenia. The contract between them was void, and what she did now was her own concern. Aegisthus beside her was quiet. Till finally he said, "This changes nothing. I know. When the time comes, I will do what is needed, as will I." They did not speak of love. Love was not part of the pattern they were weaving. But there was a bond now, forged not in affection, but in shared purpose, and the intimacy of those who have looked at the abyss together and chosen to step forward rather than back. The household, watchful as all households are, began to notice. Servants whispered. The guards exchanged glances when Aegisthus entered or left. Electra, whose eyes missed nothing, saw and said nothing, her face carefully neutral. Orestes, still young and absorbed in his own world, remained oblivious. Clytemnestra made no effort to hide the relationship, but neither did she flaunt it. Aegisthus came and went as he had before, always with the pretext of business, always careful to observe the forms. But the nature of their alliance was shifting from political to personal, and those who paid attention understood what that meant. Winter deepened toward its heart. The reports from Troy came less frequently now, the sea too rough for regular travel. The last message said that the war continued, that Agamemnon was well, that Troy remained unconquered. There was no mention of when he might return. The silence stretched, and in it Clytemnestra found room to breathe, to plan, to prepare. She continued her work at the loom, the pattern growing under her hands. The net was nearly finished now, a thing of terrible beauty, tight and intricate, and strong enough to hold whatever it was meant to hold. She looked at it sometimes in the lamplight, and thought of Agamemnon walking home through the lion gate, triumphant or defeated, and how he would step onto the crimson cloth she would spread before him, and how the net would fall. The house was ready. The household was ready. She was ready. All that remained was to wait. 10 years is a long time in the life of a mortal, but in the life of a curse, it is only a breath. The war at Troy ended as such wars do, not with a single decisive blow, but with exhaustion on both sides, and a trick that let men call surrender by another name. The Achaeans built a great wooden horse, and left it before the gates, then sailed away as though admitting defeat. The Trojans, weary and desperate to believe the siege was over, brought the horse inside their walls. That night, warriors hidden in its belly emerged and opened the gates, and the Achaean army, which had only pretended to leave, returned and took the city. Troy burned. The walls that had stood for 10 years fell in a single night. King Priam was killed at his own altar. His sons were slaughtered. The women were taken as prizes, distributed among the victorious kings like portions of meat after a sacrifice. Helen was returned to Menelaus, and whether she went willingly or not, the songs did not say, or said different things depending on who was singing. The news reached Mycenae in fragments, carried by traders and travelers who had been near the coast when the fleet departed. Troy had fallen. The Achaeans were victorious. The kings were coming home. Clytemnestra received the news in the great hall, standing before the household as they gathered to hear what the messengers reported. She listened to the details, the horse, the burning, the division of spoils, with a face that showed nothing. When the messenger finished, she thanked him and ordered that he be given food and a place to rest. Then she dismissed the household and returned to her chamber. Aegisthus was waiting there. He had been living in the palace openly for the past 3 years, no longer pretending to reside elsewhere. The household had grown accustomed to his presence, had learned to navigate the reality that the queen had taken her husband's enemy as her companion. Some accepted it, some disapproved in silence, but none spoke against it openly. Clytemnestra's authority was absolute, built over years of careful management, and those who might have challenged her had been gradually replaced or won over, or simply learned that loyalty to the queen was wiser than loyalty to an absent king. "It is time," Aegisthus said. Yes. They had been preparing for this moment for years, but now that it had arrived, Clytemnestra felt a strange calm, as though she were watching herself from a distance. The anger that had sustained her was still present, cold and pure, but it had been refined by time into something closer to certainty. This was not vengeance taken in hot passion. It was justice, measured and deliberate, the closing of an account that had been open since the day Iphigenia died. "How long before he arrives?" Aegisthus asked. "Days, perhaps. A week at most. The winds are favorable." "The household is prepared?" "Yes, the guards are ours. The key servants know their parts. When the moment comes, there will be no resistance." Aegisthus nodded slowly. "And the children?" Clytemnestra had thought about this many times, had turned it over in the dark hours before dawn, when even the most certain plans seem fragile. "Electra will stand with us. Orestes." She paused. "Orestes must be kept away. He is still too young to understand, and he loves his father. When it is done, we will tell him that Agamemnon died honorably, that there was a struggle, a necessity. By the time he is old enough to learn the truth, it will be too late to change it. He will hate you when he learns. I know. You are willing to accept that." Clytemnestra met his eyes. "I accepted it the day I chose this path. A mother's love does not erase a mother's duty, and my duty is to Iphigenia, who cannot speak for herself." Aegisthus reached out and took her hand, and they stood together in silence, two people bound by shared purpose and the knowledge that what they were about to do would mark them forever in this world and whatever lies beyond. The days that followed were strange. stretched thin, as though time itself were holding its breath. Clytemnestra went about the preparations with the same care she brought to any great undertaking. She ordered that the palace be cleaned and decorated, that garlands be hung, and the altars piled with offerings. She instructed the servants to prepare a feast worthy of a returning king, to slaughter the finest animals from the flocks, to open the storerooms and bring forth the best wine. To all appearances, she was preparing a celebration. In the women's hall, she supervised the final work on the great cloth she had been weaving for years. It was finished now, a magnificent piece of fabric, dyed the deep red of wine or blood, embroidered with patterns that seemed to shift in the lamplight. It was meant to be a carpet, a path of honor for the king to walk upon when he entered his house. But it was also a snare, a net disguised as welcome, and those who looked closely might have seen in its patterns the shapes of traps and tangles, the geometries of binding. Electra helped with the preparations. She was 16 now, no longer a child, her face set in lines that suggested she had already made her choice and would not be turned from it. She worked beside her mother in silence, weaving the final threads, checking that everything was in place. She did not speak of what was coming, but her presence was its own statement, a declaration of alliance that needed no words. Orestes, now 12, was excited by the prospect of his father's return. He spent his days practicing with his sword, imagining the stories Agamemnon would tell, the glory of the war, the fall of Troy. He pestered his mother with questions about the preparations, wanting everything to be perfect, wanting his father to be proud. Clytemnestra answered him with patience, allowing him his joy, knowing it would be brief. On the evening before Agamemnon was expected to arrive, Clytemnestra went to the household shrine and made a final offering. She poured wine to the Erinyes and spoke the old words, asking that justice be served and that the dead be honored. She did not ask for mercy or forgiveness. Those were not part of the pattern. When she rose from the altar, she found Electra standing in the doorway, watching. "Are you afraid?" the girl asked. "No, I am," Electra said quietly, "not of what will happen, but of what comes after. What comes after is another day. We will face it when it arrives." Electra nodded and left, and Clytemnestra stood alone in the shrine, looking at the small flames that burned on the altar. She thought of Iphigenia, young and bright and trusting, walking toward the altar at Aulis. She thought of the moment when her daughter had understood what was happening, when trust had turned to terror, and the last thing she had seen was her father's face, implacable as stone. The flames burned steady, and Clytemnestra turned away and went to prepare herself for the morning. The watchman saw the signal fire first. He had been stationed on the roof of the palace, as he had been every night for months, watching for the beacon that would announce the king's return. When the distant light flared on the mountaintop, he shouted the news, and the whole household stirred into wakefulness. Runners were sent down to the harbor. The servants began the final preparations. The palace, already decorated, seemed to hold itself in readiness, every stone aware that something long awaited was about to arrive. Clytemnestra dressed with care. She chose a robe of deep purple, the color of royalty, and bound her hair with a silver fillet. She looked at herself in the polished bronze mirror and saw a woman who had aged in the 10 years of Agamemnon's absence. The lines around her eyes deeper, her mouth set in a shape that had forgotten how to smile easily. But her gaze was steady, clear, and she met her own reflection without flinching. Aegisthus came to her chamber, dressed for the occasion in fine cloth but without ornament. He would remain in the background during the initial welcome, a presence but not a challenge, allowing Agamemnon his moment of triumph before the end came. "Are you ready?" he asked. "Yes. There is still time to turn back." Clytemnestra looked at him, and a ghost of a smile touched her lips. "You do not believe that?" "No," Aegisthus admitted, "but I thought the words should be said." They went down together to the courtyard, where the household was gathering. Electra was already there, standing to one side, her face composed. Orestes was near the gate, practically vibrating with excitement, his pedagogue trying to keep him still. The servants lined the walls, and the guards stood at attention, bronze gleaming in the morning light. The sound of the procession reached them before it came into sight. The rumble of wheels on stone, the cadence of marching men, the low murmur of voices. Then the gates opened, and Agamemnon entered Mycenae. He came in a chariot, standing tall, his armor bright in the sun. He had aged as well, his beard more gray than black now, his face weathered by wind and war. But he still carried himself with the authority of a king, and his eyes swept over the household with satisfaction, taking in the decorations, the gathered people, the welcome that had been prepared. Behind him came the spoils of war, carts laden with bronze and gold, with fine cloth and weapons, with all the wealth that Troy had held. There were captives, too, Trojan women stumbling in their chains, and among them one who stood apart, not in chains but not free either. A woman with dark hair and eyes that seemed to see too much. Orestes broke free from his pedagogue and ran forward, and Agamemnon stepped down from the chariot and caught the boy up, lifting him, and for a moment his face softened into something almost tender. "My son, you have grown. Father, tell me about Troy. Tell me about the battles. In time, boy, in time." Agamemnon set Orestes down and turned to survey the household. His eyes found Clytemnestra, standing on the steps of the hall, and he walked toward her. Clytemnestra descended to meet him. They stood face to face, husband and wife reunited after 10 years, and the household watched in silence, waiting for the words that custom required. "You are welcome home, my lord," Clytemnestra said, her voice clear and formal. "It is good to be home." Agamemnon looked at her more closely, and something flickered in his face. Surprise, perhaps, or unease. She was not the woman he had left. That woman had been softer, more yielding. The one who stood before him now was harder, honed by years of rule and grief into something that did not bend easily. "The house has been kept in good order," Clytemnestra continued. "As you see, we have prepared a welcome worthy of your victory. You have done well." His eyes moved past her, scanning the courtyard, and caught on Aegisthus, standing in the shadows. Agamemnon's face closed like a fist. "What is he doing here?" "Aegisthus has been a guest in the household," Clytemnestra said calmly. "He has helped me manage the estates in your absence. I told him to leave. You did, but you were not here, and I chose to invite him to remain." The air between them went very still. Agamemnon's hand moved toward the sword at his belt, then stopped. He was surrounded by his own household, by servants and guards who should have been loyal to him. but he could see the way they looked at Clytemnestra. The deference, the certainty that she was the one who commanded here. The balance of power had shifted in his absence, and he was only beginning to understand how completely. "We will discuss this later," he said, his voice tight. "In private. Of course, my lord." Clytemnestra gestured, and servants came forward, bearing basins of water for washing. Agamemnon allowed himself to be attended to. The dust of travel rinsed from his hands and face, while the household watched. When he was clean, Clytemnestra signaled again, and 2 servants brought forth the great red cloth, unfurling it before the entrance to the hall. "I have prepared a path for you," Clytemnestra said. "Walk upon it into your house, as a king returning in triumph should." Agamemnon looked at the cloth, at its rich color and fine weaving, and hesitated. "This is too precious. It should not be walked upon. It was made for this purpose. Do not refuse the honor your victory has earned." There was something in her voice, a challenge, and Agamemnon felt it. To refuse would be to show uncertainty, to admit that he feared some trap. And before the household, before his son, he could not afford to appear weak. He stepped onto the cloth. It was thick and soft beneath his feet, the color of blood still wet, and as he walked toward the entrance of the hall, the servants began to sing, an old hymn of welcome and victory. Clytemnestra walked beside him, her face serene, and behind them came the household in procession. At the threshold, Agamemnon paused and looked back. His eyes found the woman who had come with him from Troy, standing alone by the chariot, forgotten in the moment of arrival. "Cassandra," he called, "come inside. You will be given quarters befitting your station." The woman, Cassandra, did not move. She stood with her head tilted, as though listening to something no one else could hear. And when she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "I will not enter that house. It smells of blood, old and new. The stones themselves cry out with it." Agamemnon frowned. "You will do as you are told. You are mine now, taken in war." "I am Apollo's," Cassandra said, "and Apollo has shown me what waits inside. You walk into the net, king of Mycenae. You walk into the trap that has been prepared since before you were born." The household stirred uneasily. Prophetic women were respected and feared, and Cassandra bore the marks of one who has been touched by divinity. The strange stillness, the eyes that see beyond the visible. But Agamemnon, impatient and irritated by the delay, waved her words away. "Madness," he muttered. "She has been mad since Troy fell. Take her inside by force if necessary." 2 guards moved toward Cassandra, and she allowed herself to be led, unresisting, her eyes still fixed on something distant and terrible. Clytemnestra watched this exchange without expression. Then she turned to Agamemnon and gestured toward the hall. "Come, my lord. A bath has been prepared, and food. You must be weary from your journey." Agamemnon followed her inside, and the household fell in behind, and the great doors closed on the sunlight, sealing them all in the dim coolness of the palace. The hall was as Agamemnon remembered it, the same pillars and painted beams, the same smoke-blackened ceiling. But something in the air was different, a weight, a presence that made his skin prickle. He told himself it was only strangeness, the disorientation of returning to a place that had remained the same while he had changed. Clytemnestra led him to the private chambers, where a bath had been prepared in a great bronze tub. Steam rose from the water, scented with herbs, and fresh clothes were laid out on a bench. Servants stood ready to attend him, but Clytemnestra dismissed them with a gesture. "I will tend to my husband myself," she said. "It has been 10 years. Let us have this moment without witnesses." The servants withdrew, and Agamemnon began to remove his armor, piece by piece, the bronze clattering as it was set aside. Clytemnestra watched him, her face still serene, and when he was naked and stepped into the bath, she moved closer. "You have aged," she said, "as have you. War ages men, grief ages women." Agamemnon settled into the water with a sigh. "You speak of Iphigenia. Yes, it was necessary. The fleet could not sail. The goddess demanded." "I know what was demanded," Clytemnestra interrupted, her voice still calm, still controlled. "You sent for her under false pretense. You let her believe she was coming to a wedding. You killed her on an altar like an animal, and you did it so that you could sail to Troy and claim glory." Agamemnon looked up at her, and for the first time he seemed to see the depth of what he was facing. "She died for Achaea, for all of us. It was not my choice. It was your choice. You could have refused. You could have stepped down, let another lead the fleet. But you chose glory over your daughter's life. And now you must answer for it." She reached behind her and took up the red cloth that had been folded there, waiting. It was not the same cloth he had walked upon, but another, finer, woven with the same pattern. Before Agamemnon could react, she cast it over him, the fabric settling over his head and shoulders, clinging to his wet skin, entangling his arms. He tried to rise, but the cloth was everywhere, wrapping him, binding him, and his hands could not find purchase on the slick sides of the tub. He shouted, but the fabric muffled the sound, and then there was another presence in the room, Aegisthus, stepping from the shadows where he had been waiting, a blade in his hand. The first blow caught Agamemnon in the shoulder. The second found his neck. He struggled, thrashing in the water, but Clytemnestra held the cloth tight, and Aegisthus struck again and again, methodical, thorough, the bronze rising and falling until the water ran red, and Agamemnon's movements slowed and stilled. When it was finished, they stepped back. The room was silent, except for the drip of water from the cloth, the slow spreading of color across the floor. Agamemnon lay in the bath, his eyes open and unseeing. The net that had been woven for him finally closed. Clytemnestra let the cloth fall and looked down at her husband's body. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a vast emptiness, as though something that had been taught inside her for 10 years had suddenly released, leaving behind a space that did not know how to be filled. "It is done," Aegisthus said quietly. "Yes." They stood together in that room for a long moment, and then Clytemnestra turned away. There were still tasks to be completed, words to be spoken, a household to be managed. The dead could wait while the living made their arrangements. She opened the door and found Electra standing outside, her face pale but composed. "Is it finished?" the girl asked. "Yes." Electra looked past her mother into the room, seeing the red water, the still form, and her expression did not change. "What of Cassandra? She is still a witness. She must be silenced as well." They found Cassandra in the chamber where she had been placed, standing by the window, looking out at the sky. She turned when they entered. and her face was calm, almost serene. "I know why you have come," she said. "I have known since Troy fell. Apollo showed me my death as he showed me the city burning. I do not resist it." "Why did you come, then?" Clytemnestra asked. "You could have refused to enter the house." "Prophecy does not change fate. It only allows us to see it more clearly." Cassandra smiled, sad and distant, and perhaps there is mercy in knowing, in being able to compose oneself for the end. Aegisthus moved forward, the blade still in his hand, and Cassandra knelt before him, baring her throat. The blow was swift, and when it was done, she crumpled to the floor without a sound. Her prophetic eyes finally closed. They left the chamber and returned to the hall, where the household was waiting, gathered in uneasy silence. News had already spread that something had happened, that the king had not emerged from his bath, that the queen and Aegisthus had been seen moving through the palace with blood on their hands and clothes. Clytemnestra stood before them, and the murmuring ceased. She looked out at the faces, some shocked, some knowing, some carefully neutral, and she spoke clearly, without apology or plea. "Agamemnon is dead. He killed my daughter, and for that crime, justice has been done. I claim the rule of this house in my own right, and in the name of my children. Those who will serve me are welcome to remain. Those who will not may leave, unharmed, and seek service elsewhere." The silence that followed was absolute. Then, one by one, the key figures in the household, the captain of the guard, the steward, the chief among the servants, stepped forward and knelt, acknowledging her authority. They had been prepared for this moment, bound to her over the years through obligation and shared interest, and now they chose the practical course. A few left, gathering what they could carry and departing through the gates. Clytemnestra watched them go and did not stop them. She had expected some resistance, some refusal. That there was so little spoke to the thoroughness of her preparations, the years of careful work that had preceded this day. Orestes burst into the hall, his face streaked with tears, the pedagogue trailing helplessly behind him. "Where is my father?" they are saying. People are saying. Clytemnestra knelt and took her son by the shoulders, looking into his face. "Your father is dead, Orestes. There was a quarrel, a struggle. It happened quickly." "No, you are lying. I want to see him." "You cannot. Not yet." Orestes pulled away from her, his face twisting with grief and rage. "You killed him. Everyone is saying it. You and him." He pointed at Aegisthus with a shaking hand. "You killed my father. Your father killed your sister," Clytemnestra said, her voice steady. "He sacrificed Iphigenia at Aulis so that the fleet could sail. He chose his own glory over her life. What has been done today is justice for that crime." "I do not believe you. Father was a hero. He would never—" "He did." Clytemnestra's voice was hard now, unyielding. "Ask anyone who was there. Ask the servants who carried the messages. Ask the gods who allowed it to happen. Your father was many things, but he was not innocent." Orestes stared at her with eyes that held a child's incomprehension and the first stirrings of a deeper knowledge. A recognition that the world was more complicated and cruel than he had been allowed to believe. Then he turned and ran from the hall, and the pedagogue hurried after him. Electra, standing to one side, watched her brother go and then looked at her mother. "He will not forgive you." "No. When he is older, he will seek vengeance. It is the pattern." "I know. Clytemnestra rose and looked around the hall at the household that was hers now, bought with blood and years of preparation. She felt the weight of it settle onto her shoulders, heavier than she had expected. She had thought that justice would bring relief, that the long tension would ease. But instead there was only emptiness, and the knowledge that what she had done would echo forward through time, shaping her children's lives as surely as the choices of Tantalus and Pelops and Atreus had shaped her own. The pattern continued. The curse was not broken. It had only found new vessels, new forms, new ways to express itself. That evening, as the household made arrangements for the bodies and the necessary rituals, Clytemnestra stood on the walls of the palace and looked out over Mycenae. The city spread below her in the fading light, smoke rising from cook fires, the sound of voices carrying on the wind. It was the same city she had first seen when she came here as a bride, young and uncertain, but she was different now, transformed by time and choice and the inexorable logic of vengeance. Aegisthus joined her on the wall. He stood close but did not touch her, respecting the distance that had opened between them now that the work was done. "What comes next?" he asked. "We rule, we hold the house, we prepare for what follows. Orestes will grow, he will remember. Yes, we could." Aegisthus paused, choosing his words carefully. "We could send him away, to another kingdom, where he could be raised without the shadow of this day." Clytemnestra shook her head. He would still learn. The story would find him, and it is his right to know, to choose what he will do with that knowledge. I will not deny him that, even if it means my own death one day. "You are very certain." "I am certain of nothing, except that the pattern does not end here. What we have done will be answered, just as what Agamemnon did has been answered. That is the nature of the curse. It continues until there is no one left to carry it forward." They stood in silence as night fell, the stars emerging one by one, cold and distant and indifferent. Below them, the palace settled into an uneasy quiet, a house that had seen too much death and would see more before the story was finished. In a small chamber, Orestes lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind trying to hold two truths that could not both be right: that his father was a hero, and that his father had killed his sister. The contradiction was unbearable, and he did not yet know that he would spend the rest of his life caught between them, torn by loyalties that could not be reconciled. In another chamber, Electra sat at her loom and began a new pattern, red and black, the colors of the house of Atreus, the colors of blood and mourning. Her fingers moved steadily, without hesitation, weaving the threads into shapes that would not be fully visible until the work was complete. And in the chamber where Agamemnon lay, washed and prepared for burial, the servants worked in silence, their faces careful, knowing that they served a house marked by the gods, where every act of violence gave birth to the next, where justice and vengeance were so entangled that no one could say where one ended and the other began. The net had fallen. The king was dead. But the pattern continued, would continue, must continue, because that was the nature of the curse, the price paid by those who thought they could act without consequence, who believed that power or cleverness or even necessity could exempt them from the old laws, the ones written in blood and stone, and the memory of the earth itself. Clytemnestra stood on the wall until the stars were all visible, the whole vast tapestry of them, and she thought of Iphigenia, young and bright and lost, and she wondered if her daughter's shade, wherever it walked in the dim halls beneath the earth, knew that she had been avenged, and whether that knowledge brought any comfort in the darkness. She did not know. She could not know. But she had done what she could do, had paid the price she was willing to pay, and if that was not enough, if it was only another thread in the endless weaving of violence and counter-violence, then so be it. She was mortal, and mortals do what they can with the time they are given and the choices they are offered, and beyond that, there is only the silence of the gods and the cold indifference of the stars. The wind rose, moving through the citadel, carrying with it the scent of smoke and blood and the sea far below. Clytemnestra turned from the wall and went inside, back to the palace that was hers now, to the throne she had claimed, to the children who would inherit the curse she had perpetuated, and the darkness closed around her like a familiar cloak. Neither comfort nor torment, but simply the condition of living in a world where every choice has weight, where every action echoes forward and backward through time, where the net is always being woven and always falling, and no one is ever truly free. And so the story continues, as stories do, until someone, somewhere, finally finds the courage or the wisdom or the simple exhaustion to say, enough. But that day has not yet come, and perhaps it never will. And in the meantime, there are only these moments, these choices, these lives lived in the shadow of the curse, trying to find meaning or justice or simply survival in the narrow space between what must be done and what can be borne. The palace slept, or pretended to sleep, and above it the stars turned in their ancient courses, and the gods, if they watched, did not intervene, for intervention was not their purpose. They had set the pattern in motion long ago, and now they simply waited to see how mortals would navigate it, what choices they would make, what prices they would pay, and whether at the end of all things there would be anything left but the silence and the dust, and the memory of stories told by firelight to children who do not yet understand what they are hearing. The night deepened, the wind continued, and in the halls of the house of Atreus, the shadows moved like living things, patient and hungry, waiting for the next act, the next generation, the next turning of the wheel that grinds forward without mercy and without end.